So good evening, everyone. My name is Zara McCauley. I'm the operations manager for Kingston WritersFest, and I'm delighted to welcome you to an evening with Michelle Good, which is the second in our bi-weekly series of pre-season festival events. So thank you for joining us. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd like to thank HarperCollins Canada for their support of tonight's presentation, and wanted to mention that Novel Idea Books has copies of Michelle's remarkable debut novel, which we'll be discussing tonight, which is Five Little Indians, and those are in store now and also available for purchase and for online shipment. They're easy to find online and on Facebook, and they're only a phone call away. So just look for Novel Idea Kingston. And now to the main event, an evening with Michelle Good. I'll start with a brief introduction of our interviewer, Waub Rice, and then I'll turn it over to him. So Waubgeshig Rice is an author and journalist originally from Waubgeshig First Nation. His first short story collection, Midnight Sweat Lodge, was inspired by his experiences growing up in the Anishinaabe community and won an Independent Publishers Book Award. His debut novel, Legacy, followed in 2014, with French translation published in 2017. His most recent novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, became a national bestseller, won the OLA Forest of Reading Evergreen Award, was shortlisted for the John W. Campbell Memorial Award, and the First Nation Communities Read Indigenous Literature Award. It also appeared on numerous library and community selection best of lists. Canadian Notes and Queries praised Waub, saying he has a lovely ear for the cadence of conversation, humor, rage, and introspection, all coming through the dialogue. Rice's story teaches, but is not didactic. It's original. So please welcome Waub Rice.
Miigwech Bonjour, Minonakshik, Waubgeshig Indigenous, Makondo Dem, Wasaksing Nunchba. Hi everybody, I'm very delighted and honored to be with you all tonight via the Kingston Writers Festival. I've had some great experiences in Kingston over the years, and I'm very thrilled to join you all virtually this evening to chat with Michelle Good. I am a great fan of her and her work. Five Little Indians blew me away, so I'm really honored, really excited to spend this evening with you all. So how it's going to work is I will introduce Michelle. She will do a reading, and then she and I will have a bit of a conversation, and we'll of course open it up to you all to close out tonight's session. So again, Shmiigwech, thank you very much for spending your summer evening with us, albeit virtually. You know, this is the way things are going these days, but you know, one silver lining is we're able to connect from across the country and maybe reduce our carbon footprint a little bit. And by extension, invite more of you on board to join our conversation. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Michelle Good. She's a writer of Cree ancestry and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. She obtained her law degree after 3 decades of working with Indigenous communities and organizations. She's practiced law in the public and private sector since then, primarily advocating for residential school survivors. She earned her MFA in creative writing at UBC while still practicing law, and her debut novel, which we will discuss tonight, Five Little Indians, won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada. Michelle Good lives and writes in South Central British Columbia and is currently working on her second novel. So everyone, please welcome Michelle Good.
Hello, and here I am. Thanks, Waub. Should I just go into a reading then?
You may, if you don't mind, you may as well, and then we'll get into a chat after that.
Yeah, I'm good with that. So I'll just give a little background because it's not a big long reading. And so this is one of my characters, Clara. And Clara becomes involved in the American Indian movement. And this part that I am picking up on is just at the very end of her having a confrontation with a border agent, with a border cop. And that's who Cool Hand is, described with his big glasses. And so that's who he is. Okay, so I'll just pick up from there. Cool Hand swaggered to his booth, but Clara saw him looking at the cars backing up behind the mess of her stuff. Trunk thrown open, clothes and camping gear strewn around like a messy autumn. Clara called John Lennon. It's okay, man. He's just a pig. She scratched the broad, tawny expanse of his head, making her hand look so small. The woman who dumped him told Clara half of him was a kind of dog for hunting lions, ridgeback or something like that. Not pure, she said. The shepherd got to his mama and ruined the batch. What the hell did she know? John Lennon, you are perfect. Cool Hand walked back from his booth, looking through Clara like she was pink as Doris Day or something. Clean us up, ma'am, and move on. He handed her back her Indian card, dropping it just before she reached to take it. She left it there on the ground until he turned his back to them, then scooped it up and slipped it into her back pocket. Reaching for her underwear, strewn among the dog food, Clara whispered to John Lennon, "He's just tired of us now, boy." John Lennon smiled. She scooped up all the dog food, double handful after double handful. God damn if John Lennon was gonna go hungry over this guy. Clara pulled out slow and smooth, the Washington State Trooper parked on the other side of the line in Oroville, just waiting to pull over some Indian and her dog. Clara didn't look at him as he looked at her all the way by. She instead jacked up Buffy on the cassette deck and put the pedal to the metal, but not too hard. Clara thought for sure John Lennon raised his eyebrows sitting there in the passenger seat, trying to look like he really wasn't uncomfortable. She pulled over at the first open area to let John Lennon run and stretch his legs while she put everything back in its place. No room for a mess in a 61 Falcon with a giant dog and pretty much all her worldly possessions. Clara triggered the front passenger seat lever, pushed the seat back down as flat as it would go, leg room for John Lennon. She laughed to herself, thinking about the first time someone heard her calling him. By now, she was used to that frozen look people would get on their faces when she'd be calling around after him, "John Lennon, John Lennon." She didn't have to call him this time. With the car back in order after the border pillaging, Clara walked around towards the driver's door, and that was enough for him to know. He ran to her through the purple flowering weeds, tongue lolling and happy. Weeds. She remembered George telling her once that Indians were like weeds to the white people, something to be wiped out, so their idea, sorry about my dog, something to be wiped out so that their idea of a garden could grow. He told her weeds were Indigenous flowers. Clara, you're an Indigenous flower. Don't ever think of yourself as a weed. That was what he said to her. John Lennon knocked his head against her hip, his version of hello, and jumped into the driver's seat. He sat there for a minute laughing at her and then crawled over to his side so she could get in. You crazy dog. Clara slid into the driver's seat, wiped the drool off the steering wheel. She put the car in gear and eased back onto Route 97 towards Omak. Oliver, Soyuz, Oroville, Omak. Oh, 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 oh. She wondered what that was all about. She turned the music down and John Lennon curled into sleep. Buffy and her singers were like a willow broom, whisking the ugly feeling from the border cop right out of the air around her. She thought of a fried egg sandwich at Omak. Then she thought of that day George pulled the weeds out of her heart, leaving only wild purple flowers.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What's your dog's name?
I got two. One of them is Iggy, and the other one is the dude.
Yep. So not Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr then, eh?
No. But you know, John Lennon was a dog I once knew.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
He's memorialized. Yeah.
Immortalized in book, in literature.
Yeah.
So just to start off, Five Little Indians, remarkable narrative, follows 5 children from residential school through their release and escape and all the way through adulthood. So just broad question at the beginning, Michelle, how did this book come about?
Well, I have been involved in issues regarding residential schools since the early 90s. Before that, in a personal sense, but professionally, in the 90s when I was practicing law. And one of the things, like these stories of what happened to these little kids and the harms that were as a result of them is something I listened to day after day for years and years. And but I still kept hearing, even though these things were coming out, like in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and, you know, the courts were public and so on and so forth before we got into an arbitrated process, is that people just kept saying, why can't they just get over it? Mm. And so I wanted to have an articulate answer to that. Mm. I can tell one person, but I can write a book and hopefully tell many, many more. And so that was the motivation, combined with understanding how these residential schools had impacted my own family. Mm. And that, you know, we just cannot move forward until there is, we hear a lot about truth and reconciliation, and my feeling about it is there can be no reconciliation without truth. And the truth has to come first. And the truth is the hardest part of that, because once people get a feeling about what it's all about, they're anxious for reconciliation, unless they're a monster. Yeah. So, yeah, so basically that's why I wrote it.
And you touched on what was going to be my next question, just the multiple voices. You know, you have 5 very strong perspectives here, Kenny, Lucy, Clara, Maisie, and Howie. Mm-hmm. Why was it important for you to do that, to interweave these different narratives of these different characters?
Well, because I didn't develop characters in a sense of, okay, I'm going to tell, you know, I've got this person, I've got, you know, Maisie, Lucy, Howie, Clara. You know, I didn't do it that way. I read over the course of my career hundreds of psychological and psychiatric assessments of people that had suffered the abuses that were common in residential schools. And I understood the impacts of those on a person's psychological well-being and their mental health. And so what I did was I created experiences. Okay. And from those experiences, I sort of said to myself, okay, how would that impact a person during the course of their life? Okay. And then I developed the characters to be consistent with the impacts that a person would suffer. For example, if their abuse was primarily physical, how that might play out, and so on. And of course, those things cross over between the characters, but that was sort of how I wanted the whole picture. Yeah. I didn't want one person's story. I wanted the whole picture. Yeah. So
going along from there, there are so many great books out there about the residential school experience and survival, but most of them are memoir or nonfiction. You know, I think of Bev Sellers' They Called Me Number One, or Basil
right.
Johnston's Indian School Days. So books like that are firmly in the canon, but there's not a whole lot of fiction. You know, Richard Waugemi's Indian Horse touches a bit on the residential school experience, but I don't think there's much dedicated fiction. So why did you want to go with the fiction route?
Well, because there's a lot out there, right, in the nonfiction realm or genre, if you will, and people were still saying, why can't you get over it? And so I thought, something's not happening. I'm thinking, you know, for example, how many people have actually read the Truth and Reconciliation Report or would be able to? And I also felt that one of the best ways to teach, to communicate, is through story. And that's something that is our traditional way of teaching, is really through story. Mm-hmm. And with fiction, I felt that it would create kind of a safe place, that if the person could pick up the book and go, oh my God, and then they could say, oh yeah, well, it's just fiction. But then it gets them in the end, because if it's fiction, but it's very true. And so that was why. And I had rejected the notion of nonfiction early on, even before I had conceived of this book. But that was really why, is to give people a safe, comfortable place where they have a way out if they need it, okay, which usually makes people want to stay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that was sort of my thinking on that.
Well, for me, it was really eye-opening to read this book, because I realized that my own, I guess, knowledge and my own, I guess, consumption of stories relating to residential school survival were really limited only to one voice often, right? And I didn't think often about how these different people really intermingled and related with each other, not only while in residential school, but also once they're on the outside and well into their adulthood. And I guess for you, it's just an opportunity to provide this much broader, maybe even more realistic perspective.
Well, yes, because I believe from my own experiences that because these people that had to go to residential school experienced something that was so rarefied, I don't know if that's the right word, but so different from anybody that didn't go to one of those things, that they gravitate to each other because they understand what they've been through. Okay. So I think there was a sense of mutual protection, loyalty, and understanding. And that's why they gravitated towards each other. So they wouldn't feel so alone in their experience.
Yeah.
You know, looking even to other Indigenous people that didn't have to go. And, you know, there's a gap of the ability to understand if you haven't been, right? So, yeah.
And that is very much my experience. Like my father and his siblings, fortunately, didn't have to go. You know, my grandmother was able to keep them home. So I think reading books like this and my previous work as a journalist has all been about learning, you know, learning the impacts and that sort of trauma and intergenerational sort of traumatic learning and sharing of those experiences and tragedies. But it also, though, I found these characters really relatable, you know, like especially as they moved into adulthood and sort of became activists and sort of worked to advocate for Indigenous issues. It reminded me of like my parents' generation as well at that time during the 70s and 80s. So the characters, again, very relatable. Are they based on anybody real, or any elements of them based on real life people?
Clara, a little bit. And I wouldn't say that she is based on her, but there was a person that was in the back of my mind a lot of the time that I was writing about Clara, and that was Anime Aquash. And that, yeah. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little more about that, or do you want to move on?
Well, sure. For those of you who don't know who Anime Aquash was, she was a Mi'kmaq woman who went down and joined the American Indian movement and was a key player in what happened there and lost her life to it as well. And but there's I don't know exactly where it is. I haven't got it marked, but there's a passage in the book that I took a quote that Anime had said, and then I just altered it so it wasn't actually Anime, but it was her saying, you know, when all those raggedy ass pilgrims, and that was her word, when all those raggedy ass pilgrims, they came over here and they took over, right? And she said, well, you know, and there weren't very many of them, but they took over. And she said, and there aren't very many of us raggedy ass Indians, but this raggedy ass Indian isn't going to give up and is basically, but we're going to take over again as well. Right? So, you know, and I had actually thought about naming the book Raggedy Ass Indian. Wouldn't quite sort of be as all encompassing as one would want, right? Oh dear. So,
speaking of the title, why did you pick Five Little Indians?
It just kind of came to me. This book had many, 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 many titles. And then one day, and it just came to me and I thought, yes, because I love these characters. They're like my kids, right? Like I just love them. So A, they're my Five Little Indians, okay? But B, there's that terribly racist song.
Yeah.
Right? That horribly, horribly racist ditty that little kids sing. And I wanted to have that there as basically saying, you know, this is what these children had to face, okay, was that extreme level of racism where nobody would even think twice. When I was a kid, nobody would even think twice about, you know, saying things like that, singing things like that, right? So that basically was that, and it just felt right. It felt so right. I was going to call it Indian School, and I was going to call it something else. I can't remember, but this is the title. This is
Yeah.
the one I loved. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it works excellently. We'll get back to some of the elements of the book in a bit, but I'm interested in chatting a little more about your career and your path to writing, and
Sure.
how your legal background sort of, I guess, intertwined with your journey as an author.
Yeah, it did. And I graduated law school when I was 43. I went to law school when I was 40. I graduated when I was 43 and practiced for a few years. And then 2007, I set up my own little firm. And that's when I started doing exclusively residential school advocacy. And I had been doing it before, but not exclusively. And to me, my whole life, it feels like my whole life has been activism for our people in one way or another, whether it was the activism of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, was my activism as a lawyer, and now my activism as a writer. And it doesn't feel like they're separate parts. It's all part of the same journey, right? With the same objective in mind, which is for people to understand what really happened here and what we really need in order to be recognized for who we are in this land. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Oh yeah, for sure. And then what is, from there, what inspired you to get your MFA?
Well, I didn't go to the MFA program to get an MFA. I really could care less about the degree. I did it because I was practicing full-time. And I knew it was time to start working on this book that I wanted to work on, and I needed a structure that would require me to do it. Otherwise, you know, when you're practicing law, that has to be your priority. But if you're enrolled in an MFA program, then you cut back on some of the work that you're doing so that you can meet your commitments. But so that's why I did the MFA program, primarily was so that I could write this book, this very book. I went to the MFA with this idea in mind. So yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So there are many paths to becoming an author. What would you say to aspiring Indigenous authors about how to get to that point? Or what sort of words of encouragement would you share with them?
Don't give up. Just don't give up. Look at me. I've just published my first novel at 63 years old, right? It's never too late. If this is something you want to do, sit down and do it. Find yourself a wonderful mentor. There's lots of people that are so generous with their time and, you know, are willing to work with people. Sometimes it costs a little sunyao, right? But it's, but you know, it's, there's a lot of support for that. And especially young Indigenous writers, it's so important that if you feel the urge to write, I believe what you're feeling is an urge to tell stories in, you know, in our cultural milieu.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say. Don't give up. Believe in yourself. Your ideas are just as good as anybody else's. And, you know, maybe you won't succeed, but you know what? Maybe you will.
Yeah.
In my wildest dreams, I wouldn't have expected that my book was being received the way it's being received. And so I'm kind of gobsmacked, I gotta say. So yeah, so for young writers or new writers, just go for it. Just do it. That's the only way.
Well, the accolades are very well deserved. It's a unique book, as mentioned. I haven't read anything like this, and you know, I really appreciated it. What does it feel like for you to see, you know, nowadays we're learning more and more of Indigenous authors coming up and getting published and having their space to tell their stories and receiving similar accolades. So how does it feel for you to see this sort of movement happening?
It makes me dance, man. It makes me so happy because our voices need to be heard in every way, whether it's political, whether it's artistic, whether it's cultural, our voices need to be heard. And, you know, when I was, I remember the day, by the way, when I understood literary fiction. I was just getting out of, I was in foster care, and I had told my social worker that if I didn't get to live alone, I was going to die and it would be his fault. So he allowed me to live alone in my own little suite, and I went to school like the nerd I am. and I was in an English upgrading course, and we were introduced to Ethel Wilson, Margaret Lawrence, Alice Munro, Margaret Atwood, all those brilliant Canadian women writers. And I understood it like, oh my God, I get it now. I mean, I'd always been a reader, right? But that the way language is used in literary fiction, it's like meanings in songs, that the meaning is woven in the words, that it's not, you know, sort of, it doesn't slap texture, right? And now I forgot the question. What was the question?
Well, it's just, we were just carrying on about I guess the moment right now of so many Indigenous authors coming into the spotlight.
And that's what I was going to say, was at that time, the only Indigenous author that I was aware of was Maria. And I mean, Maria is just an amazing human being and an amazing writer. But then we had the Rita Joe, which was written by a white guy, George Rye. It's a beautiful play, but you know, it was written by a non-Indigenous man. And then we had Kinsella and his nonsense, right? And my middle name is, you know, tell us how you really feel. So, you know, there was such a dearth of our voices. And so when I see this now, I wish that it had been like this when I was young. I really do. But it's beautiful that it's happening now. And and you know, it's the work of so many people that have, you know, opened the doors or knocked them down, or a combination of the two. Yeah.
I totally agree. And you know, I think back to when I was in high school in the 1990s and not knowing about the Indigenous authors who were blazing trails at the time. And sometimes I think about my peers. Like, I was fortunate to have an aunt who gave me those books outside of the curriculum, right? And introduced me to those brilliant storytellers like Lee Maracle and Richard Waugernese and so on.
Yeah.
But I think about my peers at the time who didn't have that opportunity to learn about these brilliant storytellers and maybe what they might have missed out on. But, you know, I was really encouraged by what you said about you don't have to be a certain age to emerge as a writer. You know, it can happen anytime in your life, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And, you know, it's kind of how you do things. Apparently, I went to law school at 40, right? So, yeah, so just not giving up on learning and doing, right? Yeah. So I don't care if you're 12 or, you know, 90. If you want to do it, do it.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
So getting back to the novel, being urban is a big part of it. Big part of the story takes place in Vancouver. Why was that important to highlight?
Well, for me, well, two reasons. One is that, you know, I was living a life similar to these kids in Vancouver at around that time. And so it was a backdrop that I was extremely familiar with and that I was able to really incorporate without a lot of struggle, right? But the other thing that I think is more important, I mean, that's just sort of my technical reasons, but what's more important is that so many of these kids never got to go home. They never did get to go home, or they went home and it was so destroyed. The whole relationship with their families were so ruined and so broken, you know, that they didn't feel like they belonged there anymore either. And, you know, would gravitate to the cities and, you know, find their community there the way my 5 Little Indians found their community in Vancouver, right? They coincidentally all went to the same school, so they kind of knew each other, but that's sort of it. Yeah.
Well, I think that's also so relatable too, whether it's Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal, Calgary, Winnipeg, Edmonton, you know, you have these pockets of people who really were displaced from their homes and you know, have yearned for a community. And one thing that really inspired me about the book was, you know, the various paths to healing, right? You know, I think often we fall into this notion that, okay, you need to go into a sweat lodge or you need to learn how to smudge and then you'll figure it all out. It'll work out for you.
Right. Oh, it's, you know, sadly, it's much more complex than that, right? But one thing I did want to point out is the impact of Christian influence in the schools, where, you know, Indigenous spirituality was devil worship and, you know, and pagan and all those awful words, right? And I wanted to characterize that because, you know, I don't know how many people understand that, and it was a huge thing. What one character goes through, what Clara goes through in trying to avail herself of help that is available to her through Mariah, but she has to fight down all of that negative stuff that she got while she was in residential school, and it's not an easy path. And yeah, so yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that gets back to your original, I guess, goal of having these broader perspectives, right? And just how I think much more effective that can be by telling these sorts of stories in fiction.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing that's very, like, there's nothing that's linear about this, about our stories in terms of our history in this country. It's all very layered and textured.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, you know, and you know, we're, you know, in terms of Indigenous literature, though, the storytelling has just begun.
Mm-hmm.
It really has. It's just begun.
I agree.
Yeah.
Another thing I really appreciated, and I wish I sort of highlighted some examples, but I didn't ahead of time. But one thing I loved was just the conversational tone between the characters and the vernacular, like the slang. You know, there's almost like a universal slang across nations.
There is, yeah, there is. It's absolutely true, and yeah, I mean, it's true. And anybody that has, you know, anybody that is Indigenous or has spent a lot of time with Indigenous people would recognize that, right? Mm-hmm. It's that, you know, non-Indigenous people have their slang, but we have ours, and it's unique to us. Right? Yeah. It totally is, yeah. So that's, I'm glad you picked up on that. That's great.
Yeah, well, it was really comforting at the same time. You know, it's just it's so cool to see representation in that way. You know, and that's what I really love. I'm going to ask maybe a more technical question that some other authors or writers may be interested in. A couple of moments switch to first person. You know, most of the book is told in third person, right? Maisie's part is told in first person, and a couple of Howie's chapters are told in first person as well. So just interested in knowing why you did that.
Well, there's one place where in a certain terminal chapter about Kenny where it goes from third person to first person. And I wanted that specifically as a signifier that something very intense had happened. Okay. And that also, I don't want to give it away here, but that also what had happened to him could only be experienced and understood and perceived by him. Okay. And so the third person narrator wouldn't have worked for me in that sense, right? With Maisie's story was so intense that I felt that it was best to have her tell us, as opposed to have the broader sort of third person voice. Same with Howie. And I thought I changed Howie all to third person. I think Howie's all third person.
Yeah, I may have misread.
Yeah, but yeah, because those are the only ones that I recall, is that Maisie for that reason, and also Kenny for a more technical reason, right? To, you know, sort of put the reader on notice. Like I wanted the reader to go, oh, that switched, and then be cognizant of something important happening there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I won't give anything away, but I sort of wondered about that, especially with Maisie's part, because it is particularly intense, and you know, the outcome of that part as well. From there, I mean, that's some pretty heavy stuff. You know, there are some traumas that each character experiences. As the author, as the storyteller, is that difficult? Do you need to step away sometimes? Do you need to heal at times as well, or how does that work for you?
You know, no, I didn't need to step away. You know, like I said before, I spent all those years listening to these stories day after day after day. And actually, I think just writing this book was my way of stepping away, was my way of healing from that, because I challenge any lawyer that was truly acting for their clients in a meaningful way to say that they didn't experience secondary trauma. We certainly did. And, you know, just to hear some of the things that I don't even want to talk about right now, just, you know, with wee little kids, right? And yeah, so writing it was a way of, I guess, putting four corners around that experience for me. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
You mentioned this earlier too, you know, the necessity we still have to like almost convince other Canadians that these are legitimate experiences and this is their country. This is what their country is responsible for. But we still have deniers, you know, most notably a politician here in Northern Ontario who made headlines for denying that abuse. What do you think it's really going to take to get Canadians all on board with understanding and accepting their true history?
Well, frankly, I think that there are people that are always going to just, you know, that don't care. And there are people that are racist, right? And just think, you know, I mean, I experienced work with a lawyer who worked for government who thought it was all made up. I said, really? Right? Well, not so much that it was all made up, but that they didn't experience the kind of harm, you know, that they had. And I said, so why is it that, you know, things like disproportionate incarceration, disproportionate, you know, mental health issues, disproportionate everything, addiction issues, so on. Why is that? Are we just inferior people? Is that what it is? Why is that? And so, I mean, I think there are people that will always say, phooey. But I think that the key is to just keep talking about it and to talk about it in a way that is not accusatory, because I don't think that gets us anywhere. But just to talk about it in a way that says to people, look, it did happen. And it happened here. And it was the residential schools were a key aspect of the colonial toolkit, okay? It was critical in terms of getting Indigenous people off the land. And, you know, I do some speaking engagements sometimes about the residential schools. And one of the things that I say always, because my father was non-Indigenous, and, you know, is I say that I'm what they wanted. Okay, except for my attitude and my good book, right? I surprised them, what can I say? But, you know, is that I'm fair. I don't speak my language except a very little bit, and I don't live on my territory. That's what they wanted. Yeah. And that I believe in my heart of hearts, I totally believe that my mother married a non-Indigenous person, because at that time we were then born as white people, right? So that we wouldn't have to go to these schools. Yeah. I firmly believe it. And, you know, I mean, how sad is it that a mother has to give up that in order to protect her children, right? Yeah. So, but I think we just need to keep saying it, and saying it in a kind way, saying it in a truthful and forceful way, but always with kindness, because you just don't get anywhere being angry, even if you are, right? And there's a place for it. But, you know, I think people don't even now understand it in the context of colonialism. I think there's a lot of people, like a certain senator, who think it was well-intentioned, and it wasn't. I think we all know it was not well-intentioned.
Yeah. I'll open it up to questions from our viewers in just a moment here. Just one last broad question for you from me, Michelle. Are you hopeful? What do you think about the future of this nation?
I live on hope. Hope. If we don't have hope, we don't have anything, really. And we have to be hopeful. And I look at, like I said earlier, what we've managed to accomplish in one generation. I mean, to think about having Indigenous senators, Indigenous members of parliament, Indigenous members of provincial legislative assemblies. You know, I sit on a number of quasi-judicial tribunals as an adjudicator. You know, to have our people infiltrating all right? And we did that. It wasn't given to us. We did it. And we did it in one generation. Iggy, cut it out. So, I am hopeful. My life to this point has demonstrated that there is reason to be hopeful, and that's because of who we are as people. Indigenous people were brilliant.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I will get to the questions in just a second. I will say, I don't know if you all heard, but there's a 3.5-year-old boy here who is almost ready for bed, so you may have heard him in the background. So I apologize.
That's okay, we love it. No apology.
My wife Sarah, she has, we also have a 2-month-old baby here too, so she's minding both at the moment. So shout out as always to my wife Sarah. So
yeah, shout out to the babies too. Gotta love the babies. Yeah,
these the next generation, right? These are the young Indigenous ones who are growing up subsequently with more experiences and more role models such as yourself, and yeah, they're coming into a very wonderful world for sure.
Absolutely.
So here's a question from Nancy, and the rest of you viewers, please don't be shy. Ask your questions of Michelle. It'd be great to hear from you all. So Nancy says, I'm sure there are as many different stories as there are survivors. Did you have a challenge developing 5 characters, or did you have trouble winnowing it down to 5?
I didn't. I decided on 5 at the beginning. Why I decided on 5 at the beginning, I'm not sure, but I decided on 5 at the beginning. And this was my first novel, and to have this kind of structure was very challenging. But I never once thought about leaving one of these out. So yeah, I had just decided at first, right at the beginning, it would be 5.
Yeah, and it all works wonderfully. It flows so almost seamlessly, and just the way they come in and out of each other's lives is just so intriguing. I really appreciated that. Anybody else have questions? I have a couple I've left over that I could ask Michelle, but okay, good question here from Beth Campo. You did mention another book coming. Can you talk about what your next book is about?
Yes. My next book is, again, challenging the non-Indigenous view of history. And it's going to take 2 characters. I'm giving myself a break this time. Instead of 5 characters, 5 unruly children, I have 2 characters. And one of them is based on my great-grandmother, who was present at the Frog Lake incident. I won't call it a massacre. And I wanted to, and the second character is based on my mother, who I told you about was during the 40s. She was in New Zealand. You still had to get passes off the reserve, but my mom managed to get to New Zealand to train as a nurse, because in Canada, Indigenous people were not allowed to train as nurses. Hold to the free. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to. My great-grandmother never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was a young woman. And I am trying to write about that time in history, right around the Métis resistance. And when my ancestors were chased across the border, like literally my family, and ended up in Rocky Boy Reserve in Montana. And I want to talk about that history from the perspective of a young woman in the camp, in Big Bear's camp. And then that's how the novel will open. And then there is that grandmother teaching her granddaughter, who is my mother, about what life was like and what you can expect from the Munyao, which for our non-Cree speakers means non-Indigenous people, and how that impacted Eliza Sunshine, who is the character based on my mother, and the choices she made. And so that's in broad strokes what I'm hoping to do, is to again shine a mirror on a time in history that is understood in a certain way in Canadian history, but is understood in a totally different way in Indigenous history. So that's basically it.
Tremendous. Wow.
Yeah.
Question from Barbara. How would you characterize the writing experience?
Of this book?
maybe just in general, what writing is like for you?
Well, you know, I think I was born to be a writer because I was that nerdy little kid at about 10 years old that was walking around with a little journal under my arm, right, writing everything. And what I've learned about it is that writers are listeners and observers, and we collect all of these experiences, and then, you know, it's almost like a rich mine to you know, delve into, to draw on for your writing. And but I had some of the most profound and beautiful moments while I was writing this book, where my own awareness of things broadened, and my own you know, my own belief in the capacity to heal was entrenched, you know, coming off a bitter 14 years of doing this work with survivors and seeing that damage firsthand so often. So yeah.
Another question from the Q&A section. How did you reconcile your feelings around having settler and Indigenous ancestry when telling stories of the Indigenous way of life?
I didn't have to reconcile that because I don't consider myself to be non-Indigenous. My understanding of myself is that I'm Cree. I have Indigenous blood, but my worldview is Cree. My training is Cree. My ceremonial training is Cree. That's how I understand myself in the world. I'll tell you a little story. When I was about 9 years old, my mother had the most beautiful skin, right? It was just coffee and cream complexion, just gorgeous, right? And, you know, she was of an era, they wore foundation makeup and stuff like that. And I remember I was 9 years old and I went into the bathroom and I took her, locked the door, and I took her makeup and I put it all over my face, all over my neck, my forehead, everything, so that I would be brown. Because I wanted to see what I would look like, right? I wanted to see what it was like to look like, what I felt like inside, right? So I don't think of myself as, you know, there's not something in me that says, well, this part is non-Indigenous and this part is Indigenous. It's like, you know, I am a Cree person, and that's how I experience myself, my spirituality, my, you know, my way of living in the world. Yeah. So
yeah, I would add, yeah, exactly. And I'm similar background too. You know, my mother's white settler, and the way I see it is, you know, we, you know, those of us of mixed heritage have been othered anyways, right?
yeah.
And I think in that sense, we are so-called marginalized, and we will be seen by the legal community, by the country itself, by all authorities as Indigenous people anyway, you know? And that's one reason why. I mean, we could talk all night about some of these identity hang-ups too, you know, but
Yeah,
that's the way I do personally too. You know, I'll always relate as Anishinaabe, but I'll always recognize my background too. But for me, I don't see it as a personal reconciliation either. You know, it's part of speaking our truth as who we are, you know? So.
Yeah, just who we are. That's right. So
Here's a good timely question from Georgina. She says, I find the history and legacy of slavery and residential schools share similarities of oppression, colonization, and systemic racism. I feel when working in the educational system, students who are Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous create a stronger connection of unity. Have you felt connections from Black authors and readers who have expressed this connection with your book and or legal experience?
no. but just because I haven't had that experience, I live in a, you know, like I feel like I've been training my whole life for COVID, right? Like I live a very, very solitary life. And so I haven't, you know, like I don't teach in classrooms, and, you know, so I don't have that broader experience. But I suspect that what the listener is saying is true, is that, you know, because what it is racism and oppression. And we understand that no matter if we're Indigenous or if we're Black, we understand. Okay, when I look at a Black person, or when a Black person looks at an Indigenous person, it goes without saying that we've been through that, you know, that we experienced that. And so I think there is a kind of solidarity, if you will, among people of color as they're dealing with these kinds of issues. Yeah.
How does it feel to see these discussions around systemic racism happening so broadly today? As someone who's worked in various systems. Ooh. I might have lost you.
Oh, I don't know if I'm broadcasting. Anyway.
I don't know.
Oh no. Okay. So can you hear me okay, Waub?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay. So we're good. So scary. Now I forgot what I was saying.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Is that I think that things are really extreme. And I think everybody is walking around on eggshells right now. And I think that's a good thing. Okay, because for too long people didn't even think that there were eggs, much less eggshells, right? If you follow me. But I think what's going to happen is that, you know, it's going to moderate again. You know, once the necessary changes are made and we start addressing things like systemic racism in the police, systemic racism in, you know, various institutions, and we see some meaningful response to that, then I think things will calm a bit. But there is a time for intensity. There is a time to say it without compromise and to say it every single time you see it. And you know, so, you know, there will come a time, I hope and pray, that we won't have to say it because it won't be there. And, you know, one of the ways of accomplishing that is by infiltrating, by having Indigenous people and people of color in every strata of our society.
Excellent. So one more question here from the chat box. We should have time for one more if anybody wants to squeeze another one in there. But Patricia asks, did you refer to your own childhood journals when you were writing this book?
No, no, I didn't. But what I did refer to in a couple of places was stories that my mom told me. And one of those is about, comes up in Clara's story with Lily. And my mother experienced that when she was in residential school. She watched her best friend die, hemorrhaged to death from tuberculosis on the playground. And so what is in here is stories from my mom, stories from my grandma, my aunties, my cousins, you know, my own experiences and so on. But no, my journals were quite different. They wouldn't have informed this book. So,
how does it feel to have your mom and your grandma invoked in this way? How does that feel for you?
My mother died quite young for our family. We have longevity genes. Everybody appears to live into their late 90s. But my mother passed away when she was 77. And one of the things that she said to me was, tell my story. And, oh, Mom, right? So I think that some of her story is here and more of it will be in the next book. And, you know, my mother never really understood how fabulous she was and what an amazing, almost impossible thing she did. She was such a humble human being. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you want to share with us, Michelle, before we wrap everything up?
I thought I was going to do another little reading.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to do a second reading. I think we have time.
Yeah, we absolutely have time. So feel free.
Okay. So this is actually carrying on a little bit with where we started in the reading with Clara. But so now she's going back in her memory to that day at the Friendship Center when George was talking to her. Okay. That day on Vine Street, Clara stood listening as George spoke with a soft fire. She would never forget his words. Some people naively think they can hijack or control or harness the wind, driving this movement forward. Any effort to do this will fail because the energy behind this awakening, this force, is coming from all directions. Don't just believe me. Go outside. Using your own breath, try to blow back the wind in the direction from which it comes. Think of the drum, the heartbeat, the songs, and how all these beautiful sounds roll into an echo carried by that wind, from the ancestors through to the lives of our children's children. Listening to George, Clara remembered another sunny day, her heart racing. She remembered walking home from church with her mother, the wind in the birch trees, the singing. Clara's heart was racing, and she grew lightheaded, almost unable to breathe. The next thing she knew, she was lying on the floor at the Friendship Center, passed right out. George's face loomed over her, the ends of his braids brushing her face. Sister, are you okay? Clara could feel the tears nudging at her eyes. She jumped up, pushing him out of the way, and headed for the side door, running away. This sudden knowing, just too much. But she couldn't make it past the top of the side stairs. He followed, finding her there, arms wrapped around herself, as though only that would hold her all together. Sister, it's okay. Clara felt the shame rise in her at the tears that fell, her weakness right there for anyone to see. She turned away from him and he put his hand on her shoulder. The teachings show us that we learn and become strong through suffering. I can see that you are very strong. There is no shame in sadness. Clara felt the same way she had back then, with all those lilting songs dancing among the shimmering birch leaves. Something that had been gone a long time filled her again, like her heart had suddenly started beating again after a long silence.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have 4 minutes. So someone has a question, you have a question, we got time.
Well, I just want to say, Chmigwech, it was wonderful speaking with you tonight. I really loved your book, and learning a lot about it tonight was a great privilege for me, and it's been an honor. So thanks to you, Chmigwech, and thanks to Barbara and Ara for bringing me in. This has been really awesome.
Well, and thanks for having me, and thanks for being here. It's great to meet you, meet you. One day, maybe in person.
One day,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, just to extend the thank you, what a great conversation. I was getting text compliments about throughout. Yeah, thank you very much, both of you, for being here, about talking about your book, and for this beautiful, wide-ranging conversation. A reminder to everyone who's tuned in that Michelle and Waub's books are available for sale at Novel Idea. A quick thanks again to HarperCollins Canada and Novel Idea, and thank you, our audience, for joining us and for supporting Kingston WritersFest in this new format. And just a quick reminder that these wonderful free preseason events run every 2 Wednesdays from now until the festival. So next up on August 19th, we have Lorna Crozier and Steve Heighton appearing to chat about their beautiful new memoirs. So be sure to check the website for dates and times and register for these wonderful author events. And again, Michelle and Waub, best of luck. I'm so excited that you both have new books in the offing, and I know we can't wait to hear and see more from all of you. So, all right, good night.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot, Waub. Kiss that baby for me.
Okay. Bye.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.